Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I am your host, Josh Cohen. This week I speak with famed journalist and author Peter Hitchens. You likely know him as the younger brother of the famed atheist and public intellectual Christopher Hitchens. We discuss a myriad of subjects, including his thoughts on freedom of speech, his capacity as the unofficial obiter of Britain, his feud with the famed comedian Russell Brand, Islam, feminism, Keynesian economic theory, and indeed we discuss his brother as well. He was very gracious indeed with his time, and we talked for about an hour. It was a pleasure, and I think you will enjoy the discussion immensely. Thank you.
Hello.
Good morning, Mr. Hitchens.
Hello.
Cohen, how are you?
Good morning. So far, so good.
Yeah, good to hear it. Thank you. I apologize for the confusion there on my end.
Well, no, I think there was any confusion. I mean, 10 o'clock was the time we agreed. Unless my clock is slow or yours is fast, here we are.
Well, then, why don't we get right down to it then, sir. Thank you again for taking the time. I'd love to jump right to it with your permission.
Okay.
Great. So,
let's go.
Yes, sir. So I'd like to start, Mr. Hitchens, I generally like to start with a general out-of-context question. And I think the question I'd like to ask you, sir, is you told Eric Metaxas last year, if I'm quoting you correctly, "Whenever I've tried to please an imagined audience, I have failed," end quote. Now, one word that I generally repudiate is the word contrarian, which I know that you yourself aren't a fan of. And it's somewhat unavoidable to an extent, I suppose, when you are a voice against a general consensus. So I suppose my question for you, just to kind of kick us off, Mr. Hitchens, is how do you define the term contrarian? And then also, why do you not consider yourself one?
Well, it seems to me to be someone who deliberately sets out to court controversy by taking positions which are different from those of others, which I wouldn't dream of doing. I wouldn't see the point of it. I think it's what many people who can't actually understand anyone might really disagree with them like to think that people like me are doing. They think I'm doing it for effect or for money or whatever it is. And therefore, that means they don't actually have to think about what I say. That's why I reject the term, because it is one of the many defenses of a closed mind against having to think about what an opponent or a critic is saying, or even to think at all.
So, in other words, it's someone that as you say, a critic or opponent would call you simply so they don't have to pay any sort of credence to your argument.
So I would never use the term at all. And it only seems to me to be applied to conservatives, and it does one ever hear of a left wing. I'll open the quote marks here because I'm so reluctant to use the word a left wing contrarian. I don't believe one does. It's only people who are of a conservative frame of mind who ever get this rather nasty label applied to them, and it seems to me to be patronizing, inaccurate, and, as I say, a device for avoiding thought. And I hate it, and I won't use it. Interesting.
Well, that's been my experience as well. I appreciate your answer on that. I'd like to jump over to, this is somewhat random, but economic theory. Now, my understanding, as I was researching for this interview, sir, is that you identify as a Keynesian economically. Would that be a correct statement?
No, I think that would be... I don't claim to any particular knowledge of economics. I think that if one is looking at the study of the dismal science in the 20th century, then Maynard Keynes is quite obviously one of the supreme thinkers, not just in economics either, obviously a mind of immense flexibility and power, deployed on many subjects, and indeed a very politically skilled and historically aware person. And I had an argument with somebody on some internet forum in which he was deriding Keynes, and which a lot of people on the conservative, so-called conservative right do. They're often economic liberals who dismiss the whole Keynesian theory of how to deal with a stalled economy, which was largely adopted after the 1930s. And I thought it was absurd to sneer at Keynes, whatever you might think of his economic theory, and I say I'm not very qualified to have opinions on it. It was ridiculous to dismiss him as a nothing or a fool, because he was obviously a considerable thinker and a person of some achievement, and also someone who understood his own subject well enough to become extremely rich, and indeed to make his Cambridge College extremely rich through his understanding of the economy, which is often not the case with economists.
Understood. That's quite interesting to me. The reason I ask, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Are you familiar with William F. Buckley, sir?
I know who he is. Yes, I think I'm familiar with him reasonably.
I figured as much. I wanted to ask. Well, he wrote a book. Perhaps you read it, called Man and God at Yale, way back in.
I never read that one. No, I'm afraid. Well, I'm aware of it. I keep meaning to read it, but I haven't actually got around to it.
Okay, well, it's a great book. I would certainly recommend it. And the reason I bring it up, Mr. Hitchens, is in it he denounces Yale for promulgating Keynesian economics as a theory, let alone as a practice. And Ben Shapiro, the conservative commentator, said something quite similar to Mr. Buckley in his debate against Cenk Uygur at Politicon last year. So that's why I was quite curious.
Well, you're way out of my. You'll be asking me about baseball next. This isn't really a subject that I talk about very much or claim to have any knowledge of, and you're welcome to ask me about it, but my answers will be profoundly uninteresting because I don't know what I'm talking about. But it did become very fashionable among the supposedly conservative, particularly Reaganite and Thatcherite political conservatives. In the 1980s, to deride Keynes, but I just think that doesn't work, and I'd like to know what William F. Buckley's economic theory is, if he has one. But I doubt whether he knows very much more about economics than I do. I should say.
Sure, and understood, and that could well be the case. Yes,
it could, couldn't it? It's very difficult. Most economists are, as Keynes himself pointed out, politicians are almost invariably the unwitting slaves of some defunct economist who they've probably never heard of. But economists often tend to be servants of governments, providing them with reassurance that what they're doing is right. Keynes, I don't think you could say that of Keynes, because he offered advice which governments tended to begin with not to take. And then they took it often in ways which were not the ways he would have intended and took it too far, and he gets blamed for all of that.
Interesting.
I don't think Keynes would be particularly sympathetic to modern Keynesianism, for instance.
Wow. I'll have to, I think I'll have to research him.
You still there? Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, yes, sir. No, I'm here. Can you hear me?
So silence fell. Sorry, it's just that I don't think Karl Marx was terribly sympathetic to a lot of people who call themselves Marxists. It's a problem with being, once your name has been stuck on a theory, you end up often wishing, like anything, that it hadn't been.
Yeah, very interesting. Once your name gets associated with something, it's quite difficult to rid yourself of the record.
Well, if it's purely about, if as many people seem to think it is purely about limitless, rash deficit financing, then which I don't think Keynes would have been particularly keen on, then obviously that's a mistake. But if on the other hand, the recognition that governments can run deficits without going bankrupt was quite an important moment, I think, in economic history.
Wow, interesting, very interesting indeed.
I don't think it's particularly interesting because I can't really take you any further than that, and I'm sure in economic terms it's fantastically banal and probably incorrect. But you chose to ask me about this, and here I am floundering away.
Indeed, I did. Well, I'd love to move on to the subject of journalism and writing. Now, what was it? This may be a somewhat boring question, but I am curious regardless. What was it that ignited your passion for both journalism and writing? Did you have any early heroes?
I do dislike this word passion. I can write.
Yeah.
I discovered very early in my life both that I can and that I take pleasure in doing it. And once I realized that I was not going to be a destroyer captain and had to cast around for some other way to spend my life, scribbling seems to be a good way of doing it.
Interesting. Did you have any early heroes of either discipline that made you consider writing in journalism as a career?
No.
No. Okay. Interesting.
Not at all. No. I love newspapers. I always found them thrilling and fascinating. I read newspapers from a very early age, local and national ones. When I had the opportunity, I'd buy 2 or 3 a day, even when I was 11 or 12.
Oh, wow.
I produced on my typewriter, around about the age of 11, a family newspaper of a rather popular and sensationalist bent. I did a fair amount of school newspaper stuff, but I don't believe this qualifies me. As a newspaper reporter, I have to say I was never very good.
Really?
Partly because I was newspaper reporting is a very interesting trade in which at least half the skill of it is in working out what other people want. And I don't really have that. I was much more interested in my own personal understanding of it, and forgot the fact that newspapers are actually fighting in a market, and that what editors and news editors tend to want is something quite different from what the engaged reporter might want to write, which is one of the reasons why I was such an awful reporter. I mean, there were other reasons, such as straightforward incompetence, but yeah.
Got it. Where was your first reporting job?
Well, it depends what you call my first reporting job. I did a stint on the Socialist Worker, a Trotskyist weekly, one summer while I was still at college, but I couldn't really put that on my resume when I started applying for jobs in mainstream journalism. The next one was as an apprentice trainee on a daily evening newspaper in an English provincial town called Swindon. And from there, I did what you're supposed to do, which is work my way up from one paper to another, doing all the jobs and learning shorthand and law and doing reporting courts and flower shows and golden weddings, which is a very, very useful basis, not merely for journalism, but also for understanding rather more about how people live than non-journalists perhaps do.
Oh, very fascinating. And you obviously are currently at...
I'm glad you like it.
I do know. I'm a bit of a nerd for this kind of thing, so I certainly appreciate it. Excuse me. And you're obviously currently at the Mail on Sunday. How long have you been at the Mail on Sunday?
I've been at the Mail on Sunday for about 17 years.
And what's your official title there, sir?
My official title is senior writer, which means almost nothing, I think. What I do at the moment is write a weekly column and also run a blog on the Associated Newspapers, the Mail online website, which is the Peter Hitchens blog, where I write. I find having to wait till Sunday to say what I want to say about current events sometimes a bit too much of a discipline to endure. So I use the blog to let rip on more immediate subjects, and sometimes also on completely non-immediate subjects like books that I may have read or films I've seen or just general cultural or historical commentary that I want to make.
Understood. My next question, Mr. Hitchens, I never quite can wrap my head around how quite to phrase it, but what is your great noble cause at the moment? Is there a specific political ideal?
No, I don't. I've given up causes. I thought for a while that, and this is a mixture of I suppose ambition and a feeling of duty. I thought for a while that having a prominent platform in a major British national newspaper gave me the responsibility as well as the ability to try to influence British politics. And for some time, about 10 years ago, I really did attempt to do this. The problem was that nobody wanted to pay any attention to what I said, even though what I said was absolutely right. I was still maintained. And so I've rather given that up now. I regard myself as the obituarist of my country. I think that it's lost all real hope of having a serious political transformation in the right direction. So I simply write its obituary so that some future civilization studying how a peaceful, free, civilized, happy society committed suicide completely unnecessarily in the course of 50 years can avoid doing the same thing.
I've read that, and that's actually, you take the wind out of my sails. That was actually going to be my next subject to...
Well, there you are. I've saved you doing that. We can move straight on.
I would love that. Are you familiar with George Dangerfield, sir?
The strange death of liberal England.
Yes, sir. That's exactly correct.
I read it so long ago that if I read it again now, I think it would probably all come as a surprise to me. It is one of those books you were supposed to read, but I really can't remember anything about it at all.
Oh, okay, understood. Well, I won't dote on it too much, but the reason
I wouldn't, because I wouldn't be able to say anything intelligent about it.
Well, the reason I bring it up is I'm curious if you find any parallels to it in contemporary Britain in terms of...
Well, I can't really do that.
Right, exactly. So let me rephrase my question then. What do you think is contributing to the death of modern-day England?
Contributing, fundamentally what contributes to it is a series of grave mistakes, beginning, I think, with the decision to take part in the Franco-Russian war against Germany in 1914, which we had absolutely no good reason to do, and which both bankrupted us in terms of our wealth, and eventually destroyed us as a major diplomatic and military power, completely needlessly, and also massacred in the course of about 2.5 years our next generation of statesmen, poets, artists, scientists, businessmen, inventors, and simple, decent people, because we ran a volunteer army in the first 2.5 years of the First World War, and the people who went out to die in huge numbers, having been told falsely that it was a noble cause, were our best. And most of them died before they could get any children.
Wow.
So we destroyed ourselves in the most spectacular way possible. And what has been going on ever since then has been the consequences of that, and they have been myriad. I mean, the number of intelligent people we have available to run things has greatly diminished. We haven't got as much money as we used to have. We're a debtor nation instead of a creditor nation, and therefore not in charge of our own destiny.
Wow.
We lost while flailing about against actually not very strong challenge to our naval supremacy from Germany. We lost our naval supremacy instead to the United States, and we also took part in a failure to settle the boundaries of Europe, which led to a second conflict of the same kind 25 years later, and from which it was probably impossible to remain entirely aloof, and that finished the process. By the end of that, we were done for as a country. And one of the fundamental things that happened during all this, which is yet to happen to you, but I fear it will, is that of course the Christian religion, having identified itself with the First World War as a great cause, was completely discredited when so many people came home from that war, able to tell people that it had not been a great cause, but a horrible, squalid meat grinder conducted for no good purpose, of immense cruelty and misery. And I don't think that we really, and there were outward signs. People still went to church a bit. The bishops were still sort of taken seriously, and the forms of Christianity were reserved. I think after that, Christianity as a major force was dead in Britain. And that, of course, has done us immense harm.
Yes, indeed.
And it's not that there's anything wrong with Christianity. It's because the leaders of Christianity in Britain foolishly attached themselves to a secular cause. And not just a secular cause, but a secular cause which turned out to be a very bad one.
Wow, and that's, okay, very interesting. I'm curious, how, this may seem like a random question, but I'd like to ask it, how much has political correctness played a role in the decimation?
Not much. I mean, the political correctness comes partly as a result of the collapse of any other source of rules. And the reason for the success of political correctness, a phrase I'd love to replace but can't. I can't think of a replacement for it. But the success of it is largely because it appeals to people's good manners and kindness. What you're asked to do is to stop being abusive towards various categories of people to whom we previously have been quite wrongly abusive and unkind and unfair. And who can object to that? The problem is that what comes with it is an entire, very complicated ideology of supposed rights and speech codes, which make the society which adopts it much less free than it was before, and also more or less exclude various people from the political mainstream. But that's not really the fault of political correctness. That's the fault of our society for committing suicide in the first place and allowing these things to become important. If we were still a serious Christian civilization, I don't think political correctness would find any gap into which to come, because the issues of kindness, generosity, and fairness would be otherwise addressed. But like so many things, it's a negative thing. A lot of what's gone wrong with post-Christian Western society is as a result of a collapse. There are undoubtedly people on the left who desire the downfall of free Western societies, but their influence only comes because their opponents have been so determined to destroy themselves. You can't it's like the very important understanding about evil that I think one has to have. That it's very much like cold. Cold is not a thing which radiates. Cold is the result of an absence of heat. Just as darkness is a result of absence of light. You can't project darkness.
Yes.
It's not possible, nor can any more than you can radiate cold. And these things come because of the failure of the Christian conscience and Christian understanding in our societies.
So it's the absence of Christian try that again. It's the absence of Christian ideology that has contributed to the promulgation of political correctness past what...
Well, very much so, because apart from else, it tries to do several of the things which Christianity ought to have done. But it brings with it, as I say, it requires people a much narrower mind than Christianity does, and it also it's very keen on acting through suppression of things, and it's increasingly about power rather than love. And one of the crucial understandings again of the moral universe is a statement once made by a very fine Episcopalian clergyman who I used to know in Oxford, which is that power is the opposite of love, and Christianity fundamentally preaches that that society should be governed as far as possible by love. But where love fails, power and law have to intervene. And this is also the fundamental Edmund Burke point, that people are not willing to restrain themselves out of their own goodness, out of the goodness of their own hearts and out of conscience, then an external power will have to be applied to restrain them instead.
Okay.
So this is the direction in which we move. And I do think that the rejection of serious Christianity by the major Western societies has caused this more than anything else. And to blame it on those enemies of the open society who have moved in is, well, it's satisfying and enjoyable, but it's really not the point. The point is that the defenders of our society abandon their posts.
Got it. Understood. Wow, that's interesting. I haven't quite read of it in precisely that way. I'm curious to get your thoughts on freedom of speech. My understanding, as I've been preparing for this interview, is would it be fair or unfair to consider yourself an absolutist for the freedom of speech?
No, I think I would follow very much the common law that's resulted in the United States from trying to apply the First Amendment. But there are, of course, moments at which freedom of speech does have restrictions placed upon it. It can't be total, even if it's only the old rather crude, when you examine it, prohibition on shouting fire falsely in a crowded theatre. There are moments in which there are restrictions on it, but they have to be based on the assumption that you've got to come up with a really good case for saying that it's not so. We don't have the First Amendment in Britain because we don't have that kind of constitution, and we can't have it. I wish in some ways that we could, because it would mean that people were a lot more cautious about placing restrictions on it than they are. We've had a lot of laws recently, particularly on the pretext of countering terrorism, which certainly could be usable by a despotism to suppress free speech entirely.
Okay, understood. And I know
those laws simply wouldn't stand in the United States because they would be struck down because they contradicted the First Amendment.
Yes, indeed they would. I know you're familiar with Milton's Areopagitica. May I assume that you've read J.S. Mill's On Liberty?
You may.
Yes. Well,
you may find in my recent book on the drugs issue quite extensive quotations from it.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Would it be safe to assume that the essay promulgates the idea of the harm principle? Would you say that that's played a role in your thought on the freedom of speech?
Everybody has to take it seriously as a possible substitute for the Christian ethic. But I think that the difficulty is, apart from anything else, in defining harm. I often get this in arguments about drug legalization, and people say, well, what does it matter to you what I do with my own body? And I say, well, actually, no man is an island unto himself. What you do with your own body will damage other people, particularly your own family, quite possibly your neighbors, maybe your work colleagues, and perhaps society as a whole. And that therefore, if the harm principle, when seriously considered, it doesn't provide the personal autonomy that a lot of people claim that it does. I don't think J.S. Mill, if he were alive now, would accept the use of the harm principle as a justification for drug taking or indeed certain types of sexual license which cause problems for other people.
Yes.
Because it's simply not true. The personal autonomy may appear to exist in purely material terms, but as soon as you understand the real relations which humans have one to another, it simply isn't good enough to draw a firm line and say, yes, I can go off and ruin my life with heroin or some opioid or other. I'm not free to do that because of the damage it does to others.
We're all.
In saying that, I'm sort of partly accepting the harm principle as a reasonable argument, but I'm just saying it's more extensive than it appears to be.
Interesting. No, that's I've not quite thought of it that way. In that, yeah, we're connected one to another by definition. So, as you say, no man could be an island. I haven't thought of that. In plain terms, should the freedom of speech include the right to offend?
I don't know what. I don't believe in rights. I don't know what the origin of rights are. People talk about them a lot. I'm prepared to talk about freedoms. The only what are called rights, rather misleadingly, in both the English and the American Bill of Rights, are actually restrictions on the power of the state. They're the only important. They're measurable, they're definable, they're legally enforceable, and they aren't justiciable by supreme courts to mean things entirely different from what they were originally intended to mean. So I'm in favour of these freedoms, even if they are defined as rights. As I said, both our 1689 Bill of Rights and your rather later one, which is modelled on ours.
Yes.
But a freedom to offend, it seems to me to be almost a tautology. Anything you say of any interest or originality may offend somebody, but so what? That's because they've decided to be offended by it, and usually because they want to use their supposed offence, which is an entirely subjective emotion which can't be measured by anybody else, as a way of suppressing what you wish to say. And people are often saying to me, you've offended me terribly by what you've written about such and such because I do this, or I have done that, or I pursue such and such a habit or way of life. And I say, I'm sorry, I've never heard of you. When I wrote it, I didn't know you existed. I wasn't referring to you. If you're taking offence, it's because you want to. And I can't stop you wanting to take offence, but it shouldn't be a reason for me not to be able to write or say that. It's an absurdity. Freedom of speech can't be curtailed by the fact that somebody says, that offends me. It would have to be curtailed by something much more substantial than that. And generally, if it's an incitement to violence or other crime, or if say it's the equivalent of shouting fire falsely in a crowded theatre, then you're not free to say it. But otherwise, you are. Whether the fact that you're free to say it means that you should say it is another thing altogether. And I've had this argument with people about Charlie Hebdo and the Danish cartoon issue. Sure, you're free to do it, but once you've established that you're free to do it, it doesn't mean you're obliged to do it. And you'd have to come up with a very good argument if you were trying to persuade me for doing some of the things that people have done in these areas. Why do you do it? If you didn't actually deliberately set out to start trouble, then why did you do it?
Interesting. Not
But I said that's really more of a moral question than a legal one. But as far as I'm concerned, giving people freedom gives them the freedom to exercise moral choice.
Yes.
Because there's a great prayer in the Church of England prayer book in which it says, O God, who art the author of peace and lover of concord, in knowledge of whom standeth our eternal life, whose service is perfect freedom, which is the great paradox of Christian belief. But it's true, and this is also the paradox of having the perfect freedom to say what you like, is it doesn't mean that you then should say what you like.
People must.
This is not necessarily. It means you alone have the responsibility for what you say. You can't say, "Well, I'm banned from that by law," but you can say, "Should I say this morally?"
So in other words, people can say what they like, but they need to accept the logical and probable consequences of their act.
They become fully adult at the point at which they're free to say what they like. And the thing is that again, without Christian belief, this doesn't go anywhere very much. But I've noticed over a fairly long life that there is no such thing as temporal justice even in the most civilized countries. There's only a very faint approximation to it, which is why I believe so strongly that there is justice in eternity. And that is where you will find the consequences of exercising your freedom wrongly.
So would you consider the Constitution to be a secular document or a Christian document?
Well, I think it's a secular document. It's certainly not specifically. It's not specifically Christian. The English Constitution is specifically Protestant, but that's another case.
Understood. This next question.
People say we don't have one, but I promise you we do, and it is specifically Protestant. And the amount of trouble that is going to cause when, alas, eventually the current Queen's reign comes to an end is limitless. Because we were still a Protestant country in 1953, but we certainly aren't now, and it's going to be very interesting to see how people cope with what our Constitution actually says when we have to reconsider this for the first time in more than half a century.
Wow. I'm curious, would you consider yourself a feminist, sir?
In terms of, I've always said that I can find nothing whatever to disagree with in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. In terms of, I think that irrational discrimination against women, the forcing of women to away from paths of life which they can perfectly well follow is ridiculous. And why shouldn't women be professionals? Why shouldn't women do any job they're physically capable of doing? On the other hand, I think that men and women are different, and that it would be an absurdity to transmute equality into a view that they were exactly the same and should be treated exactly the same under all circumstances. I think that would be unkind to both sexes.
Got it. Do you have? Go ahead.
No, that was it. I said they're not the same. It's just and one of the most striking and immutable differences is that women can bear children and men cannot. Yep.
I think one of my favorite feminists is probably one of the early ones. It's actually J.S. Mill, in fact, as he was one of the earliest male promulgators of feminism. Do you have a particular?
Yes. Well, I think that's a rational, wonderful Victorian rational belief is very much what I think of as being a good starting point. But it's gotten mixed up with an entirely different movement, which is much more about overthrowing what it regards as the patriarchy of a male-dominated society and institutions such as that of marriage. And that's not about female equality. That's about social, sexual, and moral revolution. And that I do not support. I am a social, moral conservative.
Yes, and that's effectively my position as well. I wouldn't call this wave of misandry and incitement against men to be feminism. I would call it a simple campaign of misandry versus the first and second wave.
Well,
feminism.
I think I would take it more seriously than that. I mean, I wouldn't want to reverse its own crude terms against it. I think we have to understand as well that there is, and in our society, a very coherent, articulate, and strongly minded campaign to overthrow the social relations which have more or less dominated Western society for several centuries. They think they're right, and I think they're wrong. What I object to is their assumption of superiority in this argument. I think if we actually sat down and argued the matter rationally, I tend to think my case would come out on top. But they might disagree with that. But the problem is that's not the way in which they hold the argument. They hold the argument by claiming that my position is some sort of pathology, an ism or a phobia. Which it is not, and therefore they immediately from the very start rule out a rational discussion of equals and turn it into a heresy hunt.
Oh, I see.
That's what's wrong with the method of argument attached to political correctness. Certain attitudes are classified as basically as pathologies, as something wrong with the person who holds them. And the moment that person holds them, then that person is excluded from from serious debate and treated as a sort of unperson, and nothing that he or she says thereafter is ever listened to. And that doesn't seem to me to be a good basis for governing a society where if you hold a certain position, you're unpersoned. But that is what happens.
Wow. Well, it's certainly not a basis for discussion either.
Well, it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be a basis for somebody overcoming the other side.
Yes, understood. I'm curious now, what is the role Islam is currently playing over in Britain, both politically and culturally?
There are quite a lot of Muslims in Britain whose beliefs and desires now have to be taken increasingly seriously in a universal suffrage democracy, because there are so many of them, and because increasingly they influence the votes in several constituencies, and they're increasingly present in the academy and in life as a whole. Our society has now to deal with the fact that it has a substantial and growing Muslim minority, and that will, over the long term, change the country. Not least because Islam, unlike modern Christianity, is a pretty determined and uncompromising religion, which doesn't tend to run away when confronted.
Right. Is it true? I've read this. I don't know if it's true or not. Is it true that there is an imposition of Sharia law taking place in England?
Not really. I mean, there are some Sharia courts, but I wouldn't call it an imposition. What it is much more is it's the uncontrolled growth of an alternative legal system in our midst. Say quite a lot of Muslim women will go to a Sharia court rather than to an English official law court in terms of marital and domestic disputes.
Understood.
I think you'll probably find that although I believe it's still technically illegal, realistically polygamy now exists in some parts of Britain as well. I don't know what else either, but this is partly because we have some cities which have quite large areas which are so predominantly Muslim that they could almost be described as Muslim areas.
Wow.
And they're often solitudes with their backs turned on their neighbours. It's seldom, if ever, does it flare into anything violent or bitter, but there is a separation, and it's voluntary. People are just living their lives. They might mingle in the centre of the city or at work, but they go home to completely separate lives. And this is what's happening, particularly in the big cities of the north.
Got it. This next question, I'm wording just precisely so, because I heard you say this on I believe it was Question Time. In plain words, do you find the precepts of Islam to be a message of peace or of violence, or would you care to not comment?
Well, there's a lot about Islam which because in many ways it comes from the same origin. There's a lot about Islam which any Christian can welcome, and there are many things that are said in the Quran. I think I've not read it in full, but I've often seen it quoted, which nobody could disagree with. If only holy books weren't so contradictory, life would be so much simpler, wouldn't it? But they are. But I find that in particular that Islam's attitude towards women is one which I don't accept or wish to see widespread in my country. And I also strongly dislike Islam's inability to accept that any of its adherents might want to change their minds and leave. So those are, I'm not an expert on Islam, but those are two things which, when I have met and discussed this with Muslims, who, by the way, greatly enjoy the challenge of being disagreed with in my experience, those are the things which I've raised.
What has their reaction been to being disagreed with?
The main reaction is that's what it says, and that's what we do, and we're not changing it.
Wow.
It may be said with a smile and with some charm, but that's what they say. And this is the thing about Islam is that its scriptures are, in the views of its adherents, the unmediated word of God, and they can't alter them.
Right. Yeah, the correct, final, unaltered word of God is my understanding. I'm a neophyte of it myself, but that's been my experience.
Yeah, that's what I went to a wonderful place called Deoband in India, where there's an Islamic university, and sat down and discussed with some very, very learned and courteous gentleman in a setting rather like an old Persian painting. And it was great fun to do. But they were completely charming and very hospitable. But they weren't shifting an inch. These things these things are decreed, and they will continue to adhere to them, and that's that. You should understand that about Islam. That is one of its great strengths. It's also, of course, in some ways a weakness, but it is one of its great strengths. I find it's as I say, it's sometimes quite inspiring to see people with really serious beliefs in a world where there aren't many who have them. But I'm sorry that so many of the beliefs they hold are ones which I don't personally want to see imposed or indeed commonly held here.
Got it. It's sort of in that vein.
But I enjoy arguing with them. I don't. It's not. No. And what you probably saw from that discussion was an attempt to misrepresent what I'd said as a belief that Muslims shouldn't be allowed to live here, which is absolutely not my view.
Yes, you were very careful to say the phrase precepts of Islam, and the host tried to twist your words, and you called him on it.
He did, yeah. There was a serious attempt made to twist there, not so much by the host as by one of the other guests, but I had to fight it very hard before I was prepared to say anything else. I had to get a public acknowledgement that the twisting was false.
And you did, and then I enjoyed the speech immensely. I'd like to, in that vein, Mr. Hitchens, jump over to the subject of debate. And what would you say is the difference between debate and argument?
I suppose debate is more closely defined. A debate sort of assumes that two people approach the argument on equal terms, and that there are specific rules, and usually a vote, and some sort of chairman keeping it in order and limits on time. Whereas an argument could happen anywhere. It's a difference between I suppose, organised sport and a game of soccer played on a street corner. But that's all. An argument can be a debate. A debate can be an argument. I've probably taken part in arguments that have turned into debates, and debates that have turned into arguments, and indeed something more disorderly than that.
Well, as we're talking about disorder and someone not sticking to the rules of debate, I simply have to ask, and I hope you'll forgive the question if you must, but what are your thoughts on Russell Brand?
I have hopes for Mr. Brand. He's much cleverer than he likes to appear.
Yes.
And I think that he's dead right on one thing, which is the methadone program, which we pursue in this country, of giving heroin abusers methadone as a substitute. He is completely against it, and quite right. It is a very, very foolish mistake. And I think his ability to see that suggests that this is a person who can think. So I don't, just because I've had some pretty fierce clashes with Mr. Brand, I don't dislike him, and nor have I given up on him. I still think that he's a person capable of thought, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to find him saying much more intelligent things than he says now in his future life. Well,
I used to be a fan of his, and then I saw him call you a child on national TV when he couldn't mount an attack.
He didn't do himself any good by doing that, you see.
Yes.
But no, people make mistakes. He is yet young. I wouldn't want to. As I say, I don't ever, when I've had any dealings with him, I don't ever get the sense that I'm dealing with somebody stupid.
Ah. Got it. Well, then in that vein, do you have any general rules that you like to stick to while you're debating?
I call it the presumption of intelligence. It's much like the presumption of innocence. I assume intelligence in my opponent until it's proved beyond reasonable doubt that he's stupid. I won't use ad hominem or any of those things unless someone else has descended to it first. But as soon as they take the gloves off, then I don't feel there's any reason why I shouldn't do the same, because I'm actually quite good at ad hominem, and I really don't see any reason why I should restrain myself. If they've decided that they're not going to argue rationally anymore, then I will continue to argue rationally up to the point where it's plainly futile. But if they want to have a real ding dong, then I'm quite happy to get down in the same thing, because I reckon I'll win that too.
Understood.
So it's fun. When you've had the great frustration of the most frustrating thing about argument is somebody who's unresponsive. who, when you make a point, which is clearly relevant to their argument, neither rebuts nor acknowledges it, but just carries on as if you hadn't said it, and then puts forward another argument as if they've moved on from that stage of the argument. That infuriates me beyond measure. If someone makes a point in response to you, which if it's correct, must cause you to change your mind, then you must either acknowledge it or you must show why it's not correct. But to just ignore it and carry on as if it's never been said, that is disgraceful.
Yes. I was in discussion with a liberal a while back. We were discussing Islam, in fact, and her retort to me was, well, of course, all conservatives are racist. And
you know when you reach that point that you're not
wasting your time at that point. Indeed,
with somebody you had. Yeah, the presumption of intelligence there runs out, I think.
I would agree, sir. My last question regarding debate: what are the most important words of wisdom that you'd like to? I'd like to consider myself a student of debate. What advice would you give to me as an alleged debater for the future?
I think all that I've said, really, as I said, particularly the presumption of intelligence. But also, be prepared. If you're beaten in fair fight, be prepared to acknowledge it. Try not to be. Try to go in prepared. Know your stuff. And what is extraordinary is how many people will go into debates without bothering to know their stuff, and also know your opponent. Know who he or she is. Know what they've said before. And this is basic stuff. And again, I find so many people have not bothered to do it. And sometimes it makes it incredibly easy for me, because if they had bothered, I remember I used to argue more than once about drugs with a man called Howard Marks, who's now sadly died. Now, Howard and I completely disagree about it. I mean, he'd actually been a drug dealer and been in prison for it, and he was a very strong advocate of illegal drugs, and he would go around wowing student audiences, telling them how great it was. And we had a couple of debates, and I remembered the second one that we had. Something I'd said had plainly got at him, because he came back and he'd clearly been doing a lot of reading on it, and he had an answer to it. And I thought, that's how you should behave. I respect an opponent who does that.
Wow.
It's not whether I disagree, but so many people just don't bother. They don't. They accuse me of holding opinions I don't hold, and which the weeniest bit of research would reveal I don't hold. They argue with immense cruelty. They don't have any. They seem to have got their facts off the internet 5 minutes before and not examined them. It's extraordinary how poorly prepared so many people are. I mean, sometimes I've made failures of preparation, and I always regret them. You go cold inside when you realise that you've made a mess of it. But it's generally avoidable. Debating is probably the single most educational activity most of us will ever take part in, for both sides, if you choose to let it be.
Got it.
But it's only educational if you're prepared to do the necessary homework.
Be prepared. Yeah, well, as you say, be prepared. Show respect for your opponent. Assume intelligence. Not terribly difficult stuff. All in.
No, it isn't really, is it?
No, not at all.
The success is still not guaranteed. If the other guy can skewer you with a really good joke, then you've had it.
I'd love to discuss, with your permission, I'd love to ask you a few questions about your brother. Is that okay?
Sure. How long are we going to do this for, by the way?
Yes, I know we're coming up on our time. We have about 10 minutes left. I was thinking
Okay, right. I wasn't sure how long. I didn't ask you before how long you were doing it for. I thought now would be a good time to find out. Yeah, ask. I mean, if any question you ask me I don't want to answer, I won't answer it.
Oh, certainly. I appreciate that.
Well, that gives you complete freedom to ask what you like.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm big fans of both of yours, and I'm terribly curious.
That must be difficult.
Well, it's good to have diametrically opposed views. I find that they inform political philosophy quite well.
I'm not sure they are that diametrically opposed, actually. It's not that simple. But anyway, go on.
Yes, sir. So, your respective childhoods, correct me if I'm wrong, but you and Christopher had a rather atheist upbringing. Would that be a fair statement?
No, that's not true.
Okay. So, and what...
I don't think we got much religion at home, but we got plenty of it at school.
Oh, you did? Okay. What was it that made you jump on the path to Christianity, and what was it that you felt took Christopher down a different path?
Well, I've written about this. I mean, I don't want to go over it all again. I mean, both of us, I think, both of us found at that age when you begin to become an individual, and therefore you no longer view your parents as perfect as you thought they were. Both of us, I think, and as practically any thinking person does at some time in his or her life, we decided we didn't believe in God. I changed my mind later. He didn't. But I wouldn't want to psychologize that or go into it. We were different. As I often said, we were different sorts of people, and we were brothers. But if we hadn't been brothers, we'd never have met each other, and we wouldn't have got on with each other. We didn't get on with each other much anyway. But we certainly wouldn't have sought each other out had we not been brothers. We would never have had any interchange at all. People sometimes say, well, how can you be so different from your brother? I say, how many siblings do you know? And they're just not identical to each other. We're not clones.
I can certainly agree.
Some people have wonderful, close relationships with their brothers and sisters. And some people are twins and are almost identical. But in most cases, brothers and sisters are different from each other, and that's all there is to it.
Well, that's been my experience. I have a brother about 11 months younger than me, and we could not be more different. And if we weren't brothers, we probably would be not involved with each other at all. So I
often think that's why people are given brothers and sisters to compel them into the company of people they'd otherwise never meet.
Is there my favorite book of his, I think I'm reading currently, is a collection of essays he wrote, excuse me, called Arguably. And I'm curious, do you have a favorite book of your brother's? I can guess what your list is, but I'm curious what your favorite book is.
He didn't really write many books. If you think about it, I mean, there's a lot of collections of stuff. I mean, of things that he's written, and some were really pamphlets, such as the Mother Teresa book. But the book that occurs to me that he wrote, which I find quite powerful still, is it's been published under different titles, but I think Blood, Class and Nostalgia is the title under which it's currently published. The one about the supposed special relationship.
Yes.
That's pretty good.
And I can imagine...
He was much more of an essayist than an actual writer of books. I mean, the one he was quoting from is again, it's a collection of Love, Poverty and War and what was the other one? Prepared for the Worst and things like that. These are. But the Clinton, No One Left to Lie to, and the Kissinger book and the Mother Teresa book are really quite just extended pamphlets, aren't they?
More or less, yeah.
It's a full-size, whopping volume. So books I don't think were really his. I mean, his worst book beyond all that was God Is Not Great.
Yes.
I mean, I don't just say that I disagree with it. It just wasn't particularly good. But it also, and this is the great reflection on public life in the modern world. It was the book of his which was the most successful and the most widely sold.
Go figure.
Yeah, well, quite.
Yes. I hate to ask
a lot of people who are enthusiasts about that are often very unfamiliar with it. There's an interesting reflection here. I went to his memorial event. You can't go to his service because it wasn't religious in New York City. And there were there present quite a lot of people who'd known him most of his life, and also quite a lot of as it were, enthusiasts who came and sat at the back. And when a lot of it took the form of people reading extracts from his writings, and these were the response of the larger audience of enthusiasts who didn't know him to these was often a great deal of laughter. Because it was, in my view, the first time they'd ever heard them. The rest of us, we were all very familiar with these because we'd heard him talk and we'd read his works, and it wasn't, although they were perfectly okay, they weren't going to get the same laugh out of us that they had done the first time.
Right.
The enthusiasts, who were really fans of his way of life and of the fact that he whacked religion around the head with a blunt instrument, rather than real enthusiasts for his writing. So it was totally novel to them.
Understood.
They didn't know that most of his fanboys don't actually know what he was like or what sort of writer he was. They just it's all about his opposition to religion,
the attacks on God,
and indeed his lifestyle of drinking and smoking.
He was a big Johnny Walker Black fan, I believe, was his drink of choice.
So he said. Yeah.
I hate to be accused of asking a sappy question, but I simply must. If you have time or inclination, would you perhaps maybe like to share a story involving the two of you that most people wouldn't know?
No.
Okay, fair enough.
So that's quick, isn't it?
Yeah. I'd rather take a fast no than a slow no. So, I just have two more questions, sir, before we close our time together. Has there ever been a question that's hasn't been asked of you that you wish someone would ask?
No. I don't particularly want to be asked questions, and I'm not going to offer you an opportunity to ask me a question I don't want you to ask. No, I sometimes feel that people have. You haven't done this, but I sometimes feel when people want to interview that they haven't read perhaps 20 previous interviews with me in which exactly the same question has been asked, like why did you stop being left wing? Which I've answered so many times now that I now answer it as a formula because I'm so bored by it.
I know you have. I was curious.
So I wish people wouldn't ask me that because it's so easy to look up.
Right.
But no, I don't want my private life probed into. I think if my main advice to anybody who wants to know what I think is that I didn't write all those books to keep quiet about it. If you want to know what I think, is I've written it all down. And in quite large quantities, and it's probably better and more fully expressed there than it would be anywhere else.
Understood. I believe
a lot of books out there now. I'm amazed sometimes. So I look at them on the shelf. And think, good heavens, did I write all those? Yes, I did.
I believe I have one last question, sir, and then
all the other stuff as well. I mean, the internet is crawling with it, and all those YouTube events as well. You can watch. I mean, goodness, if anyone wants to find out about me, it's all there. And that's it, really.
Indeed. I'm curious, Mr. Hitchens, if you weren't a journalist, what do you think you would be in life?
Well, as I said, if I hadn't had this eye defect, I would have been, I hope, a destroyer captain. That's what I wanted to be. I love warships, and I would have loved me on the bridge of a Navy destroyer, but it was closed to me. And probably it was good fortune because at the time I wanted to do it, it still seemed like a realistic way of spending your life. But now most of our Navy is immobilized and motionless, and I wouldn't have anything to do anyway. I'd be too old. Whereas you don't get too old to do scribbling.
Got it. Yep, never do. Well, I believe
well, you do, but I mean, it's not quite the same. I mean, some ancient geezer who can't see and has gone deaf on the bridge of a destroyer would be quite a dangerous proposition. He said, I mean, any Navy would want to have you there, but you can get quite decrepit and still carry on scribbling.
Indeed. Well, Mr. Hitchens, I believe that was all I had for you, sir.
Well, there you are then. What will you do with this now, and how will I find out about it?
Yes, absolutely. So my plan is to put the recording together. I'm going to edit it with an intro of your life, sir, and then I was effectively just going to kind of post it to Facebook. I'm still looking to get a central platform for my interviews. I have an interview coming up actually with George Galloway, as a matter of fact.
Well, that should be amusing.
Yeah, it'll be something. And yeah, I certainly won't post.
Well, don't go unprepared into that. Is my advice.
Thank you very much.
Never go unprepared into any encounter with George Galloway.
No, he's vicious.
He generally does his homework. The trouble is he has weak points, and that he will defend dreadful regimes. But if you want to get into factual arguments with him, you need to know your stuff.
Okay, I'll make sure I do that. So I was going to put it up onto a platform, and if you like, I'm happy to send you the audio of this.
I would be very grateful if you would. Yes.
My pleasure indeed.
If I like it, I'll then post it myself, and if I don't, I won't.
No, I would appreciate that, and if you don't like it, I'd love some solid feedback. I'd be quite grateful.
Well, that would depend, doesn't it, on how much I don't like it. But if you edit it in some terrible way, then I'll never forgive you. Well, basically, this only really applies in written interviews. But I say to people, you can do anything you like with this, but if you misrepresent me, I will haunt you after I'm dead. You'll never ever be free of it.
Well, I certainly don't want that.
It's harder to do that with audio than it is with written stuff.
Indeed, and the last thing I want to do is take anyone's words out of context, so I wouldn't dream of...
You wouldn't want to be haunted by me after I'm dead either, I promise you. It wouldn't be any fun. I'd be a very determined haunter.
watching over me as I
right.
sleep. Thank you, Mr. Hitchens, so much for your time, sir. This was a real pleasure, and if I may say, in honor as well.
Well, I wouldn't get carried away, but anyway, it was nice to do. Take care of yourself. I look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Hitchens.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
And that was my conversation with famed journalist and author Peter Hitchens. It was great fun. I hope you enjoyed it, and hope that you tune in for the next one. Thank you.